Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another SIGCyber event. For those of you who are perhaps joining us for the first time, SIGCyber is the IITPSA's special interest group on cybersecurity. And we'd like to engage with webinars. We've run a roadshow. We've got another one coming up in October. So we try to get as engaged as possible. And it's great that you're able to join us this afternoon. Thank you so much for taking your time to be here this afternoon to hear about this really important topic. Really looking forward to hearing about it. And to chat to us about that, I'd like to welcome Bryan Baxter from Wolfpack Information Risk. Bryan, thank you so much for giving of your time to present to us today. And Bryan's going to be chatting to us about cyber risk in the business. And just before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping, as Bryan has mentioned already. Please make sure your mics are muted, videos off, please. If at any point you've got some questions towards the end, you can always put your hand up and we can have a chat. Or if during the session you'd like to just pop a question into the chat, you're welcome to do that. And we'll pick that up after the presentation. Right, thanks. Over to you, Bryan.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. Welcome, everybody. It's a nice warm afternoon here in KZN. Thank you for your time. It'll be very interesting to be able to engage with you this afternoon. Our topic is protecting your business from cyber risk, and I'm hoping to share some insights specifically around the benefits of a cyber risk assessment. I have asked people to just pop on a little introduction, tell us who you are in the chat, what you do. It's always good to know who we're talking to, so if that's all right. So just in terms of the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about some reasons to be concerned. What is the business impact of a cyber breach and what you can do to take some action? And then what are the business benefits of taking action? I put my email address there, and I'm going to warn you in advance. I would call this a data-rich presentation. So there's a lot of information here. I'm certainly not going to go through everything, but I'll very happily make this available to you. It may help you as a nice little reference. So please feel free to email me should you need it, or if you have any questions or need help with anything. And yes, I've been very fortunate to be involved with the special interest group in cybersecurity. Like in the introduction from Kerry Lynn, our purpose is to educate, to network, inform, and to learn from our peers. And so that's hopefully what I'll contribute towards doing today. Just a little bit about myself. I currently work for Wolfpack Information Risk, and one of my goals in life is to help customers mitigate cybersecurity risk. And basically, I've been in the industry, the information technology industry, since '92. I've been involved in a few projects in my time. I'm an active member of the IITPSA Special Interest Group for Cybersecurity, also a member of IITPSA, SIGCyber, and IC². Okay, just some reasons to be concerned, and I'm sure you'll probably know quite a lot of this already, but maybe just to set the scene. And also sometimes when we're talking about cybersecurity, a lot of times we have to now talk to executives or people that are holding the budget and try and raise awareness. And essentially that is what I'm trying to do now, is to say, how do we now present almost the business case, or how do we engage with people that may have lower levels of awareness of what the actual issues are. So one of the resources I like to refer to is the World Economic Forum. I'll be referring to a few resources during the course of this presentation. I welcome you to go and find them. They've got a wealth of information that you can download. So the latest report from World Economic Forum rates cybersecurity in terms of the SEC 2-year outlook as being number 8 in terms of risks ranked by severity. We actually have dropped, obviously, a few of the other things that have happened in the last couple of years. I won't go into those. And then also in the 10-year outlook, guess what? Cybersecurity, cybercrime is still sitting there at number 8. So it's certainly not going away. It's not going anywhere, especially with the increasing adoption of digital transformation and everything that goes along with that. I'm also going to refer quite a lot to the IBM cost of a data breach report during the course of my presentation. So in this report, they analyzed a number of breaches throughout the world. I think they analyzed over 500 companies that had a data breach. And then they worked out what's called an average cost of a data breach. And they worked it out to be 4.5 million. 4.45 million USD. Now, you can debate whether that's a relevant number, but just think about that as an average for now. And then we can also maybe ask, how on earth did they get to that number? But we'll get to that. The reason I'm raising this is there's some interesting thought processes that go along when you think about what is a data breach, what is the impact of a data breach. And why I like this chart is, unfortunately, South Africa is featuring in here for all the wrong reasons. So we're number 12 in the world in terms of what is the cost of the average data breach, which is certainly not a great statistic to be featured in. And there's obviously reasons for that, which we can have a look at. This came into my inbox today, funny enough. I didn't see it myself, but WITS had a bit of a problem with one of their websites where one of their students found that some data was easily accessible. So I'm just going to give some little examples as to what are the latest data breaches, why should we be concerned? And a lot of it is about exposure of information. So there we go. There's the most recent one I've heard about a day or two ago. And here's another list. I'm certainly not going to go through these. I'm just going to touch on one or two of them. So recently, very recently, it's been in the press and on Twitter, the Department of Defense, they reckon about 200 terabytes of data was exfiltrated. And I'll just put some names of some companies. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see the CCOM, Daily Maverick suffered a denial of service attack when India's president was left in the lurch in the airplane by a president. His country members certainly didn't like that. TransUnion, quite a major breach. 54 million personal records were accessed. And then you can just read for yourself various other companies and different breaches that they've had. And either they could have been just breached where they were hacked, or it could have been ransomware, etc. I'm going to go right to the bottom, talk about a breach in 2016. So I stay in Durban. I'm a TechWini customer, and I was part of that data breach. So over 98,000 residents' information was leaked on the net. So I'm in that batch. And then recently, I was a victim of cyber fraud. Somebody opened an account in my name at one of the telecommunications companies, and I've been paying their bill for the last 10 months. So just to bring it home, I'll give examples of what can happen when the breaches happen, but there's an example. I have no clue how somebody got hold of my data. They had my ID number, my bank account details, and they were able to go open an account in my name, and I was paying for their cell phone account for a good 10 months. So I was going to talk a little bit about the goals of cybersecurity. If you're in the game, you'll know what these are. So, but just to make sure we're all starting in the same place. So we often talk about the CIA triad, which talks about confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then I'm adding a fourth one, being safety. So basically, cybersecurity, we aim to defend all of these factors. So confidentiality means only authorized access to certain information. Integrity is safeguarding the accuracy and completeness of that information. And then availability is ensuring that you have access to information when required and that you can properly access the systems. Now, safety I've added there is an interesting one. So that's risk related to embedded systems. And there's actually a lot of embedded systems all around us. So if you think about a factory, you've got operational technology running that factory. Now, the CIA obviously can have huge impacts on business, and we're going to discuss those in detail today. But sometimes, or most times, it's either reputation or it's a financial loss or, those kind of things. But we don't often think about safety. So if something goes wrong in the plant, somebody's life and limb is actually at risk. So we're now getting into the realm where people's lives or their well-being are actually at risk should something go wrong. I can go into that into more detail, but that's not in the scope of today's presentation. Just want to talk about cyber risk quickly, just so that I can position us to understand some of my recommendations that will be coming. So cyber risk is a combination of what we could call a threat and a vulnerability. So a threat is any external force that can possibly impact on your confidentiality, integrity, availability, or safety. So it's anything in the outside world. I'll give you some examples of what those are. A vulnerability is any weakness in the design, implementation, operation, or process, and that's anything internal to your systems and to your network. And then a risk is at the intersection of those two. So there must be a threat they can exploit a vulnerability, and then you have a risk. So that risk needs those two to both exist. Just to think a little bit about the terminology that we use. I'm going to talk about what I would call our adversary. Who is the adversary, and what is their goals, and what are we facing? So if you think about external, we've got what we could call threat actors. It could be anything from nation states, terror groups, hacktivists, former employees, disgruntled employees. But the biggest one for us today is really organized crime. And then you can have a look at what is their motivations. So it could be intentional or directed, but a lot of time it's simply just about financial gain. I'm not going to go into nation states, especially what's happening in Europe right now. There's lots going on there. But if you think about financial gain, that's mostly why we have this problem today, is people just simply want money. And then you can see what is the relevance. So different things can affect your integrity or your availability. I want to talk about internal. So unfortunately, people internal to our organizations are also an issue to worry about. So we think about either our authorized users or unauthorized users. And a lot of times this would also simply be around financial gain, fraud, or collusion. Or a lot of times people could be coerced to do things. And sometimes it's motivated or not motivated. But then you also need to think about, let's go back to our organized crime. So these people have a lot of resources at their attention, or at their disposal rather. They have high levels of motivation and high levels of sophistication. So if we want to defend ourselves, we need to actually understand the enemy, understand the adversary, and what have they got at their disposal. And their goals really is the bottom. It's the opposite tier of CIA. It's disclosure, alteration, or destruction. I've just listed some groups on the left here, and it's quite interesting when you start digging into these guys. They get code names, and some of them are well known. So some of these will be organized crime, and some of these will be nation state groups that are acting on behalf of the governments. So back to organized crime. So it really is lucrative. So one of the reports I was looking at is that damages in terms of worldwide are about 6 trillion. It is definitely lucrative business, and it's growing every year. And they said by about 2025, it'll be worth 10 trillion. So that's bigger than some countries' economies. And it's a scary statistic to say it's more profitable than the trading of illegal drugs, if you just think about that for a minute. And then according to Interpol, we're also making the news there for all the wrong reasons. We've got the third highest number of cybercrime victims worldwide, and it costs us apparently around 2.2 billion annually. I'm going to be talking about the biggest threats quite a few times, and you probably know all about, or you've heard of them: ransomware, supply chain compromise, business email compromise, and data breaches. What I mean by business email compromise is any time that an email or communications to your business is interrupted and intercepted. An example could be when your supplier sends you an invoice, but somebody gets hold of that invoice, changes banking details, and next thing you're not paying that supplier, you're changing that nefarious character. Back to our data breach report from IBM. So if you have a look here, they talk about frequency and cost. So there's our usual suspects: phishing. So we really need to think about phishing. And then big target is stolen or compromised credentials. Cloud misconfigurations, I'm going to touch on quite a lot, or some more. And then we've got what we call zero-day vulnerabilities, which are actually unknown vulnerabilities. There's business email compromise. So some of these attack vectors are hard to do, but phishing is the easy one. And then if you use phishing to get stolen or compromised credentials, so that's actually the easy way in, and that's why it's the most prevalent. It's actually not that hard, technology-wise, to do that. You're basically using social engineering and psychology to trick people into doing things that they would not normally do. So in terms of the threats, we've touched on a lot of these. I've just listed them for you. I've given us 17 threats. These are external things that people in the outside world can use to target companies or individuals or organizations. So I've touched on a lot of them. So phishing is going to get worse, unfortunately, with the advent of deepfakes. I haven't got a lot of that, examples of that. But by using the deepfake technology, it's going to be very hard to distinguish whether someone is fake in terms of their picture or their voice, and they're going to get a lot more better at their messaging, and it's going to be very hard to spot these things. Third party, fourth party, supply chain attacks, big challenge. And a lot of companies now are starting a process to look at their supply chain and conduct various assessments to see if they are secure. Application security, I'll touch on a little bit. I've spoken about IoT and OT. Denial of service is when you bring it down a network. That's happened to Daily Maverick this week or last week, yeah. And then vulnerabilities, this is anything inside your organization. So at the moment, this is very real in our country, is the brain drain. There's lack of skills, lack of capacity. And in fact, we've got an event coming up where we're going to be talking about burnout. So because we've got all of this, the current work group are overworked. And if you're overworked, you're not functioning at full capacity. And that in itself is a vulnerability. Governance is a challenge, insufficient budget, cloud. We'll talk about cloud a bit more. So people think when you move to the cloud, your problems are all solved. You still have a responsibility to secure your cloud environment. It's a shared responsibility model. And cloud migrations are proving to be very juicy targets for these adversaries. Unpatched vulnerabilities, those are just common things. And then obviously the working from home model. So if you talk about the business impact of a cyber incident, I'm just going to list it for you. So when you're talking to your management, your business leadership, this is the kind of language that hopefully they could start to think about and understand. So a breach could be significant and long lasting. So there can be financial loss for various reasons. And I'll go into that. I'll give you examples. So the cost could be associated with investigating what happened, restoring your systems, compensating customers. And also what comes down to the bottom one is business disruption. So you could lose money if your production is stopped and you're not able to continue to do your business. Then obviously it affects your reputational damage, and then there's legal and regulatory repercussions. So we know POPIA is happening at the moment. They've been issuing their first fines, and I believe they're going to get a lot more stricter in terms of enforcing that. So there's a very good motivation for us to look after the data, look after the systems, and pay some proper attention to these things. There's some more examples. So if you're not secure, customers won't want to deal with you. Why should customers, allow companies to have their personal and sensitive data if they're not going to look after it? And in fact, some companies that we deal with are saying they want to be secure because they see that as a competitive advantage. Intellectual property is important. Staff health and safety, very important. I actually think that this should start to be included in the NOSA ratings and safety ratings of factories. So whenever you've got those automated systems. And then what's been happening in the States quite a lot is healthcare systems have been impacted, and that's impacted patients. And then loss of exposure of sensitive business, customer, employee data, which I've got another slide on that. So back to our IBM data breach report. When we spoke about a data breach, they've broken it up into how did they get to those numbers. So there's 4 key areas that they talk about. So the lost business cost is one of them. And then I've just given a little bit of breakdown from the report here in terms of what that could be, lost revenue, etc. And then what we don't often think about now is you've actually got to now go and do some time and effort to go and detect what's actually happened. And you've got to do various things around it. You've got to go do some potential forensic investigations, do some crisis management, and that's when people are running around. Post-breach response, that's anything to help your victims that might have been affected by the loss of their personal data. You've got to send out communications. In the case of a bank, you could have to reissue credit cards, and there could be regulatory fines, all sorts of things there. And then there's notifications. You have to now communicate. And now we are bound by POPIA to have to communicate any data breaches to the data subjects, which is interesting. So if you have a data breach, By law, you now have to report it. But I think in terms of if you have financial loss or downtime, you don't necessarily have to report it yet. But that is changing in some places in the world. The types of data that have been compromised that we need to be concerned about is your customers, what we call personal identifiable information, your employees, personal identifiable information, or intellectual property, and other types of data. And also, this is also from the IBM report, is they reckon that 82% of breaches involve data stored in the cloud. So if you're busy planning cloud migrations, or if you've got data sitting in the cloud, please consider how secure is that, how secure your controls to the cloud environment. I've just given a little graphic here on what is personal identifiable information. So it's anything relating to a natural or living person. How do you uniquely identify that person? So it could be anything to do with what you can see there, or your financial information, your biometrics, your CCTV type of information, photos, medical, educational information, etc. I've just spoken a little bit here about why be concerned if your data gets stolen. So I use my personal example of having to pay for someone else's cell phone. That happened as a result of them getting access to my personal information. This graphic comes from Terran Micro. I hope they don't mind me using it. But why would people want to steal our data? So basically, they can sell it to other people, and then they can then use it to launch other types of attacks. Identity theft is quite big. Use it for account takeover. They can take over people's social media accounts and do some kinds of other nasty things to them. But more importantly as well, the more information you have, the more valuable it is to now do targeted phishing or spear phishing attacks, and or to gain access to corporate networks. So your personal identifiable information is very important to keep secure. Okay, what can we do? So now we know that we've got some challenges. We've got some people out there that are highly motivated. What's the best form of action to take? So I'm going to start off with what we call a cyber risk assessment. But just to take a step back, so every company, well, most companies will all have a risk program and be very well aware of what the overall business risk is. So cybersecurity is just merely a component of the organization's overall risk management program. And what we recommend doing is a risk assessment, which is the beginning of that program, and then it provides a view of that organization's profile. So I've discussed what threats and vulnerabilities are. So the first step is to go and identify those threats and vulnerabilities. Second step is to do some prioritization, which I'll go into. And then a good old Peter Drucker, if you're not measuring these things and identifying them, you certainly can't be managing them. Then you need to apply what we call controls. I'll go into that. And by reducing the likelihood of impact of potential events. There's an interesting thought. So if you're on the attacking side, you only need to succeed once to launch another attack. So even if 99% of our users ignore a phishing assessment, that hacker only needs the login credentials of a single user to launch an attack. And then defenders need to win all the time to be successful. So the odds are actually stacked against us as defenders. And then typically, if we do a phishing test on a user community that hasn't had any awareness training, in fact, sorry, it's a bit higher than that. We'll see higher phishing success rates. And then as you do awareness training, you'll see that phishing success rates lower. I've just introduced here the concept of a risk matrix. Most of you should be familiar with it. So it's the same thing with cybersecurity risk. Once we've identified those risks, we'll then go and prioritize them. And then this helps us to identify what we should be looking at first. And then we look at what is the likelihood of something happening versus what is the impact on our business. And then we want to address those high risk items first and give them lots of attention. And then also I'm going to just expand on that now. I'll just take an example of those cybersecurity risks we mentioned earlier. So you'll notice I'm not mentioning the threats or the vulnerabilities. I'm mentioning the intersection of the two. So depending on what your business is, I've just rated this as an example of where these different risks would feature and what you should be and how you should treat them. And then, and unfortunately, It's more of a question of when an organization will be hit by a cyber breach than rather than if. And that's actually the sad situation we face ourselves with. So cybersecurity, one of the goals is to reduce cyber risks facing an organization to acceptable limits. So if we talk about inherent risk, those are the risks facing that organization before we've done anything. Every organization will have a different risk profile based on the specific risks facing them, based on the industry, based on the size of the organization, based on where they are. And they will have specific threats and vulnerabilities in their own environment. So, for example, if they've got a lot of systems in the cloud, then they've got various cloud threats. Or if they develop a lot of applications, they've got to think about secure development. And then the nature of their business and technology is deployed. And then risk response is we basically implement controls after we've reduced or after we've analyzed our risk. And the goal is to now reduce that risk to what we call an acceptable residual risk that the business can accept. And it's actually a management decision in terms of how much residual risk they have an appetite for. This is just another way to look at it. So the goal is to reduce risk from threats or business risk resulting from threats or vulnerabilities. And then I've given like a little plan here in terms of what is the approach to cybersecurity planning. So the first thing is, and this is almost straight out of ISO 27001, understand the context of the business. What is the business strategy and objectives? That's the starting point. Then we go back and we've spoken about it, threats and vulnerabilities, look at the risks. Very important, establish where you are currently in terms of your level of cybersecurity maturity, and then where you want to be. And that is a business decision based on the type of business that you're in. Then you prioritize risk. And then this is now where the fun starts. You decide on your risk treatment. You assess all the different types of controls that you've implemented. And then you look at developing a strategy to address those risks. And that's all basically the first thing about any cybersecurity strategy is it has to support the business objectives. And then it starts to talk about selecting a framework, looking at policies and processes. And it should be future-based. In other words, what is that business going to do for the next 3 to 5 years? And that's now going to position you to being able to move from being reactive to being proactive. Then you're going to define a roadmap to implement it. Hopefully implement the roadmap. Very important, decide on some metrics to implement and to measure how you're going. I've just given you a little graphic straight out of ISO. ISO 27001, great standard. BSR, one of the local companies that will do an ISO 27001 certification for local companies. And you can see there, it's just giving you another way of everything I've just mentioned in terms of going through right from your scope of your business, risk assessment, etc. It's just another view. I've just fleshed out every single one of those little blocks. So we talk about cybersecurity, privacy, and resilience, and combining those 3 key areas to address the threats and vulnerabilities that I've mentioned. And I've just mentioned some key frameworks here. NIST is a very well-known one, ISO 27001, which you can actually get certified against. Then the CIS controls, the fantastic controls for smaller businesses. OWASP I'll touch on. That's great for offensive security or defensive security. And then privacy, we've got POPIA would fall in here. POPIA is based on very similar principles to GDPR. And then if you want to get certified for privacy, you can look at ISO 27701. And then there's also resilience standards that you can also look at from ISO. So this is just another view of the cybersecurity, privacy, and resilience controls. And the couple of takeouts you can take from this picture is I've almost mapped a number of domains. So there's 32 domains here to think about. So if you go and study any one of those frameworks, if you look at NIST, you look at CIS, you look at ISO 27001, they will all cover each one of these domains in some way, shape, or form. So you have to cover all of these areas if you want to protect your organization in its entirety. So right from the top, you've got to get executive accountability. You've got to think about governance, risk compliance. And then you've got to establish some responsibilities within the business. And then you go down to operations. At the block in the middle, most organizations have all of these things in place. So that most organizations have very good infrastructure security. They've got firewalls, antivirus, hopefully multi-factor authentications, and all those kind of things. And then a lot of companies will have detection, which we'll touch on. Detection will go back to your SOC and your SIEM services, and then some kind of resilience. But for you to be effective, all of these things need to be in place. And then I've just rated these controls. So these things will now map to controls. And in my opinion, half of the issues are related to people. So you can put technology controls in place, but you still have to address people and process. And you can't neglect particularly your people or your process, but people are actually your weakest point. I'll just put this up. It's quite a busy diagram. Talks about the governance of cybersecurity. Just another way to look at it. So I've discussed having a strategy. This is an example of what ISO 27002 would look at, and all the different types of controls that you should have in place. And then the degree to which you have this would obviously be affected by the nature of the business and the size of the business. So for example, importantly, they haven't touched on this, you need policy, standards, guidelines, procedures. Yeah, sorry, what happened there? Okay. This is another view of that same picture. And it's mapped to a platform, and it's mapped to ISO. So it talks about your risk, your enterprise risk management at the top. How do you do information security management, and then collecting data, controlling it. And then you can also even map various technologies into this. So in the middle, you could map your SOC and your SOAR type of services. Security assessments would be your penetration testing, secure code reviews, external audits. So there's various ways to visualize the environment and what you're wanting to do. So coming back to your roadmap, so no company's got unlimited capacity or resources. So the goal is to establish where you are, like at the moment, and whatever work you may have done, because everyone's done something towards sorting out these risks. Where do you want to be, and then establishing a program to get from your current situation to your desired situation. I'm just going to come back to our IBM data breach report. So after these companies, and this to me is probably the most important slide today, after those companies were assessed and or had been breached, they were asked, what did you do? What did you go spend your money on after a cyber breach? And I actually think this is all spot on. So the first thing they did was go spend some money on incident response planning and testing. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. They then went and spent some money on employee training. And I'll talk a little bit about that. They then went around threat detection and response. I've got something on that. Oh, sorry, I've rather got offensive security. So threat detection and response is your SOC and your SIEM services. There's a lot of very good companies in South Africa that provide that. And then identity and access management was next, managed security services, data protection, and then, of course, insurance. Now, a lot of times, what's happening with insurance is I've been reading articles where people are saying, is cybersecurity becoming uninsurable because of the nature and the impact of all the breaches? And what's happening is, if you're looking for cyber insurance, the cyber insurance company is almost going to follow a very similar process to the one I've described. They're going to want to know what controls are in place and what is your risk profile before they provide insurance. So you're going to get a lot of homework when you take out your cyber insurance so that they know that something's been done. So coming back to incident response planning, this just gives you an example of what the process looks like. And I just want you to think about certain breach scenarios. So I've listed some here. One could be ransomware, or business email compromise, or data breach, or denial of service. So let's just pretend you're running a large organization. You're maybe the CIO or the CISO, and you've been hit by ransomware. Now, if you've done your homework before you got hit by ransomware, And so pre-event, you've done all these things. You've done a risk assessment, you've done some planning, you've got plans around incident management, crisis, business continuity, and you've actually tested your plans. So you've got playbooks, you know what to expect, you've got a communication plan, so you're good to go. Then the crisis hits. Now you're going to basically pull out your plan, and you're going to go through all these steps, and you're going to call in various people from the business. You're going to start looking at your recovery, business resumption, mitigation, and then you're going to do various things afterwards. So that's the first scenario. You've done all your homework beforehand, you're good. Now consider the organization that hasn't done that. They get hit by ransomware. So now you walk into work one day and nothing's working. You can't access your email, your production systems are down, customers are complaining, can't invoice, but you haven't done any of these things pre-event. Now, I think that those two people, the person that prepared is going to be in a very different mindset to the person that hasn't prepared. And I've seen this happen. The people that don't prepare, it's basically in panic stages, and they just try and spend most of their time on resuming business instead of actually recovering and finding out actually what happened and getting rid of these people out of the environment. So this is actually a very important process to follow and to be prepared for, and to do the scenarios, do the walkthroughs and practice. So if something happens, you can do it in a calm situation. Employee training, I think South Africa has done very well there. There are a number of very good institutions that are providing training. I just thought this was an interesting statistic from this site, that they said 90% of breaches begin with human error. And then they made another statement that phishing simulations can reduce your risk by 80%. So phishing simulations is almost the practical aspect of awareness training. Is now you're going to test your users, and you're going to keep testing them. And if you've got users that keep getting caught by phishing simulations, then best you keep giving them cybersecurity training until they get better. And just some key questions. Do your staff know how to identify a phishing attack? Would they know what actions to take if they were hit by ransomware, etc.? Offensive security testing is basically when we want to go and do penetration testing on a site. So that's often we'll call in ethical hackers, and they will have a go at a company's external-facing internet assets. And I've just given a list here from a fantastic resource on the web called the OWASP Top 10. And every single penetration test invariably pops up one of these things that you can see on the list here. And I've just given you some extracts from some. I've anonymized it. Penetration tests. These are real life penetration tests. And guess what? There you can see SQL injection, remote execution, cross-cut scripting, and that's in the OWASP Top 10. So the point here is, why wait to be breached? Go and get a penetration test done, or even before you get a penetration test done, go and do some scans yourselves. There's various tools that can help you with that. Go and check how your site will stand up. Go and apply the best practices out of OWASP. They've actually done your homework here. But if people haven't done these things, haven't closed these holes, it's actually not hard, because here's the top 10. Just go and try them. And you can see here on these two exercises here, we found these issues in those sites. So then you go find them, you help the customer, or the customer should then fix them, and then you try again, and hopefully they've sorted it out. Okay, business benefits. So why spend any money? Why go to this effort of taking action for cyber breach? So obviously you want to reduce the likelihood and impact. So if you can reduce the likelihood, that's good. If you can reduce the impact of a cyber breach, that's also good. So your cyber response planning will reduce the impact, and will also reduce your unplanned business interruptions or incidents. It will support the business strategy and objectives. So obviously every business has its own objectives, but one of them is obviously to stay in business and to make money. And this is a real risk to those things. It'll preserve continuity, make sure you've got business operations can continue, protect your sensitive data, maintain customers' trust. Customers are more likely to do business with companies that take their security seriously. Avoid financial losses. meet regulatory requirements, protect your brand. And a lot of companies now are looking to take advantage of new innovative technologies, which is great. But the first thing you need to do, well, early on in the process, you need to think about what is the cybersecurity risks of this new technology that you're wanting to deploy and build it into that process. So it'll enable you to safely take advantage of those digital transformation initiatives that might be coming up. And quite important for me really is that you've demonstrated due diligence. So if something does happen, the first question, or one of the questions that'll be asked down the road is, well, what did you do about it? What did you do to prevent this from happening? And I've given enough examples to show that it is happening. We know it's happening. It's actually everybody's responsibility to do something about it. So just in terms to summarize, and then we can take some questions. I see it's taken 42 minutes so far. So the first thing we need to do is engage business leadership. So this is a business problem, and they actually need to take responsibility. And there's a good resource here at the World Economic Forum about principles and tools for boards. Some questions for business leadership. They should know what your risk profile looks like. What is the plan? I've discussed the incident response plan. How do they stay informed about their company's risk environment from cyber? What do they know about the sensitive data? And do they know how the critical systems or crown jewels are protected? And supply chain risk, big issue. Has that adequately been addressed? I've just threw this slide in. This is a poor job position. There's a lot of stress and a lot of things to do. So not everybody can afford a chief information security officer. You can get these services from companies that can provide this as a service. Larger companies will have a chief information security officer and even several information security officers. And then this is the responsibilities of what that position does. And you'll see I've actually touched on everything already in my report, or my presentation rather. So they look at strategy management operations, they put all these things together. And it's a big area to understand. And I would say the trick for this position is to be able to engage with business leadership, to be able to communicate what the problems are in language they can understand, and then pull together the right resources to deploy it. Because they are very specialized areas, and not any one individual can know everything. So just a little bit of a summary there. I've touched on it. Cybersecurity risks are the starting point. Please watch out for ransomware, supply chain compromise, business email compromise, data breaches. Consider doing a roadmap to mitigate risk. Consider those 3 areas. So people, look at your cybersecurity awareness program. Consider high risk users. Do phishing assessments. If you don't have resources internally, get them externally. Look at your policies, and then look at your technologies, and then have some kind of a dashboard to measure progress. So that's 44 minutes. I've covered a huge amount of information. So we can open up for questions.
Bryan, thanks so much.